Welcome to our presentation on the role of policy in inclusive education. This presentation was created by Barb, Shauna, and Mandy. The School Act sets out responsibilities for school authorities and principals around welcoming, caring, respectful, and safe learning environments. These set policies are not to be used merely as a guideline, but instead they serve as the basis in which schools are required to operate. Prior to implementing effective practices, there is an underlying assumption that those involved in education share a common understanding of the inclusive practices required to adequately provide a safe and caring school. It becomes imperative that conversations are ongoing in an effort to ensure responsibilities are understood by all parties involved. Policies that place emphasis on an environment supporting and welcoming diversity encompass a whole school approach where every child has the right to feel safe and cared for. Through a culture of collegial trust, we believe safe and caring schools are achievable and that it is possible for all students to feel success.
UNESCO laid the foundation for the new focus on inclusion. During the Salamanca Conference, amongst other conferences, UNESCO pointed out the importance of individual learning needs and introduced inclusion as a global commitment. Looking at Figure 1, there was a clear point where education for all and inclusive education were clearly disconnected. There were a variety of interpretations when the Salamanca process outlined a new thinking in special needs education. Education for all had no primary focus on disabilities or marginalized groups. The Salamanca process also noted a similarity between education for all and inclusive education. During the switch from old thinking to new thinking, though, UNESCO had focused on disabilities a lot less. There was a lot of confusion by governments in how they should enforce inclusive education as well as what it exactly looked like. After 1994, there was a gradual convergence of regular education and special education, which allowed for a general education section that encompassed all learners.
Peters uses the term inclusive education to refer to the education of children and youth with disabilities in general education classrooms with their non-disabled peers. The points you see here show the ideal education for all goals, which are based on a social model, as compared with practices we are still seeing in our schools, which are based on a medical deficit model. Looking at the history of special education, we can see plenty of evidence that indicates that a move towards an inclusive education for all environment is in order. Many conventions and the resulting documents in past decades have been agreed to by many governments, so the foundation for policy making has already been laid. When we read through our division's policies regarding inclusive education, we can see much of the same wording that appears in historical documents advocating for inclusive education. Therefore, we know that the policies regarding inclusive education are in place in our divisions.
As we collaborated on our readings this week, these are the questions we continuously came back to. How is inclusion considered a new way for the education of all learners, as opposed to a new way for the education of people with disabilities? How do we better understand current educational inequalities and the lack of progress toward EFA for people with disabilities? And finally, how do we eliminate the underlying assumption that those involved in education share and act on common understandings of effective inclusive practices? After analyzing and conversing with regards to the articles from this week, we have concluded that the overall theme in looking at past and present policies as they pertain to inclusion are not representative of current practices. Even though there is a policy in place, we have a long way to go before full inclusion is achieved. As we conclude our presentation, we hope you are left with both answers and questions. In considering the role policy plays with reference to inclusive education, there is still much to be explored.